Då provar vi igen. Välkomna till Se Människan-scenen, Svenska kyrkans scen här på Bokmässan. Vi ska nu få lyssna till ett samtal mellan dokumentärfilmaren, journalisten och författaren Peter Pomerantsev och ärkebiskop Antje Jackelén. Och det här samtalet förs alltså på engelska. Welcome.
Welcome Peter Pomerantsev to guest hos Ärkebiskopen. You have written this book, which was very interesting to read, accessible and shaking. Tell us a little why you wrote this book. I mean, just the title in Swedish, Ingenting är sant och allting är möjligt. Det nya Rysslands surrealistiska själ.
Yeah, it's a very good question. When is something a collection of stories and when is it a book? Because I could have just done a few articles. And there was a moment when I realized that I spent 9 years in Russia, largely making documentary films about people. And at first, in my head, that's all I had. I had different stories. And it was actually only when I came back to London and looked back at my time in Russia did I realize that those individual people that I'd met all told the story of how Russia has developed in the 21st century, but also they were part of a larger pattern, which I hadn't seen when I was there necessarily. So from the people at the top, the propagandists, down to the girls who try to seduce super rich men as a sort of profession, they are actually informed by one social psychology, and they were all part of one new type of authoritarianism. And actually, it's only when I came back to London that I realized it wasn't chaos, that actually there was a pattern there, and something that no one had really described, because it's a new type of social model.
So it took you the distance in order to see the pattern.
Yeah.
What made you return from, it was 9 or 10 years in Russia. Why did you go back to London?
Well, 9 years is more than enough in Russia. Actually, there were personal things. I have children, and I wanted my children to go to an English school. But more importantly, maybe, was this sense that if I stayed in Russia, so I worked inside the system. I wasn't a journalist. I was a television producer making entertainment shows for Russians. And I realized that if I wanted to progress in Russia, I would have to make moral compromises. Small ones, not huge ones, but small ones. And I didn't feel, I didn't want to make them.
So did you feel afraid of being corrupt? Morally corrupt?
It wasn't, yes. I mean, essentially, yes. In a very small way, nothing dramatic, but yes. And I come from a family of political dissidents, so I guess it was actually a very easy decision for me to make. But it's one that every Russian faces every day, because the way the system works, it doesn't necessarily oppress you, it just co-opts you and gets you to be part of it and play along.
Yeah, you said this, you saw this common pattern of social psychology. Describe this pattern.
Well, listen, this is a society based on pure performance, yeah? So you have to understand that at the end of the Soviet Union, nobody really believed in communism anymore. People were just pretending, yeah? Life was a theater. You had one identity at work, where you were a good communist, and another one at home. Yeah? And everybody lived inside this schizophrenia. And then after the fall of the Soviet Union, instead of returning to reality, you just had this, this festival of fakery. So you had fake democracy and fake capitalism. Now you have a fake religious fascism, which is also no one believes in. So you have this celebration of performance and fakery, which takes a little bit of getting used to. So you have political parties in Russia, but they're all created by the Kremlin. You have news debates. You switch on the TV, and it looks like a debating show like you have in the West, with a crazy right-wing person and a crazy left-wing person screaming at each other. And it takes you a bit of time to understand that they're all literally created by the Kremlin. They're literally told what to say by the Kremlin, and the point is to make Putin look as good as possible by contrast. So it takes a little bit of getting used to. And so that's the political system. But also socially, everybody's trying on different roles, yeah? All the time. I tell the story of these girls who are, Their job is to seduce a rich man. But they intellectualize the process. They go to a special school where they learn how to seduce a rich man. And they're told things like, never be yourself, always be silent, work out what he wants and play that. Never come, when you come to your first date, don't wear any jewelry. He needs to, want to buy you jewelry. Come in a bad car so he buys you a good car. And so on and so forth. So they thought of their life as, theatre and a game.
Theatre.
And the heroes of the age, and it was reflected in the arts. There's an obsession with performance art, whether it's Pussy Riot or other artists. So in the arts as well, this fascination with performance. So it takes a little bit of time to get used to this cult of performance. And of course, people in the West take it literally all the time, when actually it's a game. But the way it... if we get into how that works as power, it's quite paradoxical. The Kremlin wants you to have different identities. I know that sounds paradoxical, because we usually think of totalitarianism as, creating little Putins or creating little Stalins and little Hitlers, and like 1984, breaking you. It's actually the opposite of that. What they want you to do is play along at work. They give you the freedom to be somebody else at home. But that means you're always split into different parts, and you can never be...
That undermines trust.
Undermines trust, but also makes impossible the idea you could change anything, because you're part of it. You're playing along, yeah? You have your freedom at home, you play along at work. If you were to really believe in an idea, you'd start demanding something from Putin. Change something, it's dangerous. Quite the opposite. They want you divided up. You can have your little corruption in your private life and your freedom, play along at work. And because you're always divided, you can never actually unite and do something whole as an individual or as a group. Yeah, it undermines trust as well.
When I visited Russia a couple of times, I think it was 2000, 2001, it struck me that whenever I got into a more intense conversation about politics and the understanding of Russia and Europe, they would always tell me, you people from the West, you cannot understand the Russian soul. The Russian soul is something very specific. Does that resonate with what you experienced?
No, but this is okay. When Russians talk about Russian soul, it's used very differently in different contexts. It's one of these words that when people don't have a word, they say, "Oh, it's the Russian soul." But here, I think we're largely talking about the paucity of psychotherapy in Russia. So psychotherapy wasn't developed. There's a boom in psychology in Russia, but it's very interesting. They don't do deep level psychology. This is not a country that has come to terms with its traumas at all. The traumas of the Civil War, the traumas of Stalinism, the traumas of the end of communism. There's very little self-analysis in society. Funnily enough, even though we associate Russian novels with that, it's actually a very repressed society. And when they talk about the Russian soul, it's actually this kind of cipher for we don't want to dig, we don't want to explore, we don't want to touch the corpses and the deaths and the murders. So it's a psychological block, and it's their defense mechanism usually.
Kremlin's Moscow may seem as an oligarchy in the morning, a democracy in the afternoon, a monarchy for dinner, and a dictatorship at bedtime.
Yeah.
How can one live with that? Is it just split personality? Is that the whole answer? Yeah,
so the only way... putting it very simply, so Putin is changing the system all the time. One moment he's saying Russia's going to be a democracy. Next moment, no, we're an authoritarian thing. Next moment, it's a Russian soul. The people who are in the Duma now, in the Russian parliament, they were good communists 20 years ago. A few years later, they were good pro-Western Democrats. A few years after that, they became good statists. Now they're self-confessed religious fascists. It's the same people, yeah? So they've changed their clothes over and over and over and over. And the only way to survive in this society is to be good at changing all the time, yeah? So it's the opposite of what a psychologist would say, be true to yourself. If you try to be true to yourself in this society, you will go mad. The only way to stay sane is by being schizophrenic.
So how should we in Sweden and other Western European countries feel about Russia? Do you see exaggerated Russia phobia, or are we naive about Russia?
I don't know. Here, there's two things. There's one which is the geopolitics, which we can have a long and boring conversation about, and things like NATO membership. And then there's the cultural side. Russia plays a very special part in the sort of cultural self-understanding of Europe. It always has done. There's a very popular idea that Russia is the unconscious of Europe, the subconscious of Europe. This is an idea that Russian writers really enjoy as well. And if it's the subconscious, it's the place where you project all your fears onto. So I think there's a lot of that about Russia. It becomes the place where you group all your phobias. You can call that Russophobia. I think it's much more interesting than that, much more complicated. But Russia is also very happy to play that role. I mean, Putin is desperate to be the baddie. He wants to be the Bond villain in the great movie of the world, because then he's important.
So how should we react? How are we afraid in the right way of Russia?
I think it's very important to demystify. To demystify the stuff about Russian soul, or there's nothing supernatural there. So you have to be very, very rational and concrete, and not to get caught up into these emotional games that Russia and the Kremlin is very happy for us to be caught up in. So it is a threat. Do something about it. Move on. The problem with making Putin the threat is that's exactly what he wants. So we have to not allow that to happen, I think.
Were you ever thinking about threat? Were you ever afraid of your own safety?
No.
Never.
No, in Russia it's very simple. I mean, I didn't do hard journalism. I made like reality shows and stuff like that, and a few documentaries. In Russia, there's two things that get you into trouble. One is if you touch the money, if you touch corruption, in an investigative way. If you follow the money, somebody will kill you. And if you touch terrorism and the links between the state and terrorism, then they'll kill you. But if you do cultural criticism, like, no one cares.
You also say a few things about the Orthodox Church. And of course, on this stage, you have to say something more about the church.
I've never experienced anything as ecstatic, inspiring, and moving as an Orthodox service. I mean,
were you brought up Orthodox?
No, I'm Jewish, but not religious particularly. It's beautiful. I mean, they are, as far as they're concerned, we're all heretics, especially Anglicans. They're the worst. And they're the only ones who have preserved the true Church of Christ. And the service is probably closest to what it was in the early church. It's very similar to the services you find in Syria. It's an utterly mystical church. It thinks that Thomas Aquinas, the rational ideas that came through Catholicism in the late medieval period are a sin. It thinks rational thinking is a sin. It sees enlightenment as a bad word. Prosvещение, in the language of the church, is evil. Yeah? It's purely mystical. It doesn't care about social issues particularly. It's all about the next stage, mystic union with God. And it's incredibly experiential. You really feel it when you go there. And it's very, very theatrical. And so it suits Putin really well. You have this kind of mystic experiences with absolutely no philosophical or moral, core, which is perfect for the state. It's always been very married to the state. I mean, it's always seen itself in concert with the state, as an extension of the state. The state deals with the everyday, the church gets your souls. What happens when the state is horrible? It doesn't seem to, it takes no moral position on that.
So, and you write that the only rational response you have found is to become surreal.
Well, if you want to survive in that society, you have to. I mean, that's maybe why I left. I couldn't. I was too Anglo-Saxon. I needed something firm under my feet. But in order to survive in Russia, you have to be able to constantly transform over and over. Or you become a real dissident, like very brave people do in Russia, and stand by their beliefs. And, we know how they pay for that, often with death.
So, but what do you mean by surreal? Is that sort of opportunistic, or what is it really you're aiming at when you say the only way to survive in this is to become surreal?
I think that might be a translation issue. I never said that in English. But look, put it this way. Let's make it much simpler. When Putin goes on international TV and with a smile says there are no Russian troops in Crimea, he wasn't lying, yeah? He was saying truth doesn't matter, yeah? He wants the West to go, hey, you're lying, Putin, so he can say, you lie too, everyone lies, there is no truth, there's just anarchy. Anarchy and power. Yeah? And mystic experiences of God with no moral content. So that's that's the premise on which you have to survive if you want to sort of flourish inside that society.
So Putin is a great postmodernist then?
I don't think he would ever think of himself that way.
Oh, I don't think so either.
But listen, we think of postmodernism as a Western trend. In Eastern Europe, you always had its own postmodernism. Some people call it Ostmodernism, yeah? So if you think about the early Kundera, who's living in the Czech Republic, in Czechoslovakia, he's completely describing a postmodern society. So I think the East had a much more radical journey to postmodernism. They just never thought about it in those terms. They were just doing it. But since postmodernist texts were translated into Russian, they're hugely successful. Everybody uses the word simulacra. I remember meeting Kacha Ben-Duchidze, who was this great reformer in Georgia before his death. And in my first interview with him, he came up to me and said, Peter, have you read Baudrillard? I'm like, Christ. And so they're obsessed with it. The Russian elites completely understood that actually Western postmodernists described the state of affairs very well in which they lived.
Mm-hmm. You also write in this book, at least in Swedish, it says that if often meet is a något aggressiv apati, so an aggressive apathy.
Yeah.
That's a contradiction in itself, in a sense.
Yeah. Well, but it's an apathy born of the sense that you can't change anything. You know, so that does make you pretty aggressive because you're always unfulfilled. I think that's something that you find a lot if you go to not just Russia, Ukraine, a lot of these countries where no change has happened. You know, this kind of abida and anger, but also the sense of helplessness at the same time. You find that a lot when you go to in that bit of the world. You know, nothing will ever change. Everything will always be like this, and resentment.
Maybe this is an impossible question, but what's worse? Economic or intellectual corruption?
You know, the funny thing is they go hand in hand. In the system that I looked at in Russia, economic and intellectual corruption were actually two sides of the same coin. Intellectual corruption is none of the words meant what they were, yeah? So you have the words elections, but they're not elections. You have the words parliament, but it's not a parliament. You have the word police, but it's not police. Same with the budgets. You know, you have these official budgets, but those numbers aren't real. They're completely fake. So it's this sense, again, that, you know, things aren't what they are. They're just all simulacra. And I actually found they were reflections of one state of mind and products of a deeper sickness of the soul, maybe. So I find they're inseparable.
So where is this going to go?
Well, the paradox of the book is, the way the book is structured is I go to Russia, 80% of the book is in Russia, and I go, wow, what a weird society with this strange soullessness inside of it, this ecstatic nihilism in a certain way.
All those suicides, right?
Well, the suicides, we can come back to that, yes. But then I come back to the West, and I see this starting to happen in the West as well. In a different way, in a different frame of reference. But since the book came out, I've seen variants on this condition happen in Hungary, Poland, bits of France, and now with Donald Trump in America. This sort of feast of nihilism and the idea that there are no facts and there is no truth that's possible, so it's fine to just make things up. That seems to be a global trend, and we could talk about why it's happening. I think there are many, many reasons. In a way, it happened in Russia first and to a really intense degree. So the book ends with this sense that this is not spreading from Russia, but actually Russia is at the avant-garde of a malevolent globalization.
Sort of a mushrooming.
You know, like Camus' The Plague, you know? One dead rat, another dead rat, suddenly it's everywhere. So there's something bigger going on, where Russia is kind of, I saw it break out in Russia very, very aggressively, but it's happening everywhere. And I think my next book will be about that.
Is there a title yet?
No, I don't know. No, not yet. Not yet. Maybe you can help me. I don't know.
Okay, but that's, I think, a topic we need to talk about when the mics are off, because they are soon throwing us off the stage here. have got to thank you very much for what you have contributed and for the perspectives you have been given here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.